This is a tentative outline of the things we're going to try to get to tonight. It doesn't always happen quite that way, but it helps to have an outline. So number one, what just happened and how are we doing? Number two, what happens in a presidential transition and how important is it? Number three, what can go wrong? Number four, what is the role of the United States Congress and particularly the Senate? Number five, how this is particularly important now because, as you know, President Trump wants to eliminate thousands of federal positions in what he calls the deep state. How might Schedule F work for federal employees? We'll define that and talk about it later. And finally, what is the role of lobbyists and big money in all of this? So lots to talk about. So Valerie, we're so glad to have you because you are the director of the Center for Presidential Transition. So let's go to the first one. When we first planned this program about 9 months ago, the tentative title was What Just Happened? We changed that because we now know what happened. My question to you is, what just happened? And maybe more to the point, what just did not happen?
Well, first, Clay, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me okay? All right, we're on. And yes, I think I think through the course of the evening, we'll talk more about what we've learned about transitions in the last 20 years, how we haven't paid enough attention to them throughout our history. But most of us did start paying attention in 2020 or so. Many more started paying attention on January 6th, 2020. And so since then, a large part of the country did expect a turbulent transition this year. It looked likely we would have two of the same candidates again. It looked likely that there would be a contested election. And in all frankness, we all spent a lot of the last year preparing for the wrong scenario. We'll talk a little bit more about the Presidential Transition Act and how we've been working for the last 20 years to codify best practices into law so that transitions run smoothly. And the last amendment that was made in 2022 asked federal agencies to share information with both candidates' teams in the case of a contested election. And this is hard for them because only one of those candidates is going to become president, and they want to be really protective of that information. So they spent 6 months preparing for that scenario, creating office space for two teams, thinking about what if one team asks a question, how do we get that information to another one? And then that's not the scenario. Within 24 hours, it was very clear that we had one clear outcome for the election. And we'll talk more about how both teams prepared or didn't prepare for that scenario. There were things that went well for the Trump team, and some things that we have learned in the last 20 years that are good best practices that they chose not to employ that might be a challenge for them as we speak. I could talk about this forever, but I'm going to pause and see where you want to go next.
And so let me ask you a personal question. So you've been around for a couple of decades in American life. Do you remember when you first thought about presidential transitions? Because we don't tend to think about it until very recently. When I was a young political appointee during the George W. Bush administration, I had to submit my resignation in 2004 and kind of get rehired after the election, and that I didn't know what was going on at all. And then in 2008, when I was working in the White House during the transfer from Bush to Obama, we were preparing briefing materials on all of the issues that the Homeland Security team was working on, and those were going up to President Bush himself. He was editing them and adding words and commas and taking it very seriously. He knew he was handing off to wars and an economic crisis, and he pledged to help whoever was going to be the next president hit the ground running. And I had no idea at the time that that was very unusual in our history, and that, and so I don't even think I thought about it very much then. It was just an additional part of the workload where you're codifying priorities at the end of the term, you're managing your daily responsibilities and crises, and you've got these extra briefing materials to create. So I don't think many people have thought about it very much at all until recently. Now we must think about it, of course. So Doug, I want kind of a short answer for this one. We'll come back to you much more in a minute, but let's go to the Constitution. You are an expert on this subject. The Founding Fathers drafted the Constitution in the summer of 1787. It was ratified in 1788. We've lived under it with 27 amendments ever since. The last amendment was in 1992, and it was on congressional salaries, something we no longer think much about. So we haven't had many substantive amendments for a while. What does the Constitution of the United States tell us about transition from one administration to the next?
There's very little. By the way, thank you for having me. It's really great to see all of you here today.
And look at this huge crowd.
I know. It's cold, the highways shut down, you're still here.
Accidents.
So it's,
thank you for coming. You were not responsible for the 275,000 car pileup.
No, I was not.
Oh, good, good.
I'm a victim like everybody else, which is why I'm not in a suit. But the Constitution says very little, but it doesn't say nothing. What it does say, I think, is somewhat accidentally related to the transition, and that is in 1932, we amended the Constitution, the 20th Amendment, moved the inauguration of the new president from March, where it had been since the founding. And very famously, George Washington's inauguration was postponed because there was cold weather, and then there was a concern over the next 100 some odd years that this time period was too long, where we had two presidents. So we amended the Constitution, we moved the date up to January 20th.
During the Great Depression and the crisis of the collapse of Wall Street.
Correct.
Because we needed to get the next president in place sooner.
Even though this is in the middle of FDR's, he was the first person inaugurated in January, it was his second term, so he was still going to be around, but yes, there was some concern about continuity. The elections have always been in November. States actually got to decide when they held elections until the mid-1800s. For president. So they weren't on the same day. And different states could run their elections any day they wanted, as long as it was a few weeks before middle of December. And it wasn't until 1845 that Congress dictated the election would be the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November to stop gaming. Some states would go early so they could dictate the candidates who would get a lot of votes, and then they'd sway the voting later. But we have this period now that's much shorter between November and January. It's meant actually to shrink the amount of time we have a lame duck president while still giving enough time to resolve legal disputes and contests. But there's also some implicit baked in idea, I think, even though it's not talked about, that there's got to be some kind of transition. The contours of what that is, the requirements, completely silent in terms of the Constitution.
So the U.S. Constitution is a notoriously brief document, under 5,000 words, 4,250 words, I think. And it leaves a lot of things unsaid, but there's nothing in it, is there, that says, well, there's going to be some shift of power from time to time. You probably want to create some protocols about that.
Nothing. It says that the president's term ends at noon on January 20th. That's all we got. And they're out. And then whatever we got to do to fill in the gaps, we need to figure that out extra constitutionally, which means we've got to find other ways to codify that.
There are two ways to do it. One is norms, and the other one is law. So, Valerie, beginning in 1963, I believe, the year of JFK's assassination, Congress passed the first of its presidential transition laws. I think you've said there were 5 amendments to it since.
And so just pause on that fact that 250 years of our nation's history, it's not until 2/3 of the way through, until 1963, that we have a law on transition. And what it did at the time was just provide some funding through the General Services Administration, that small agency that does real estate and purchasing for the federal government, provide some funding through them to president-elect after the election to start staffing up their team. And not much happened for 40 years until the 2000 contested election of Bush v. Gore. Bush had a very short transition period. Instead of the normal 75, it was around 39. And when the 9/11 Commission rolled around, they attributed part of that miscommunication to the fact that only 55% of Bush's national security officials were in place by September of that year, of his first year. in part because he had a shortened transition period. So more attention started to getting paid, and our organization started paying attention in 2008. And what the other thing that happened in 2008 was Bush and Obama both taking a very cooperative attitude towards the process and standing up structures that were completely voluntary, like a Council of White House officials to coordinate from their perspective, every federal agency appointing a senior executive to manage it for their perspective, getting those two groups to meet monthly in the 6 months before the election, having a tabletop exercise between the outgoing and incoming team, a memorandum of understanding that determined how that incoming president would have access to federal agencies despite not being president at the time. So all of these voluntary steps are things that we have helped codify through bipartisan support with senators like Mike Leavitt and Ted Kaufman, who have helped create a structure so that there is something in law around the practices today.
And 63 was the first of them, and there have been 5 amendments since, and each one has tried to create more protocols, more management of the transition.
Exactly, moving the planning process earlier. So in 1963, it was just a little bit of funding after the election. And in the 2000s, it started moving the support from government agencies before the election, so that once the nominating conventions have happened, their official candidates, GSA would provide an operating infrastructure, office space, and IT support.
So we'll come back to all that, but I just want to emphasize something that you said, which was so important, that we all remember 9/11. Almost 3,000 Americans were killed in the Islamic attacks on the United States. And the commission, a blue ribbon commission of the sort of Warren Commission sort, studied this for a long time. And they made many analyses and recommendations. And one of their analyses was that the abbreviated transition time between Bill Clinton and G.W. Bush truncated the process and may have, in some small way at least, contributed to our inability to respond to this great terror attack. So the stakes are high.
Exactly. It is a time of national security vulnerability to have a little bit of confusion about who's really in charge.
On that basis, James, if you'd go to 17 just for the moment. So I just made up this little graph this morning, but I just want to make sure everyone here knows of the magnitude of the presidency and why this is so very essential. You know, the founding fathers didn't expect us to be a nation of 340 million people in a world of cruise missiles and atomic weapons and so on. In some sense, very little was at stake back then compared to today. The Atlantic Ocean was a 3,000-mile moat between us and the old world, and so they didn't really anticipate the magnitude of the issue. So if you look at this, the President of the United States is elected every 4th year. There are 15 cabinet secretaries now. There were only 4 in Jefferson's time. 438 U.S. agencies and sub-agencies, 1,300 presidential appointees that require Senate confirmation, and 4 million or so federal employees. And under this process, those agencies are reviewed. Political liaisons come, and then non-political liaisons come to help manage the transition. It sounds like an almost impossible task, but go to the next one. Then here's what the president has to think about: domestic policy and foreign affairs. I made this for this president: economic policy, the budget, the border and immigration, the regulatory state, energy policy, and particularly one of your concerns, the Justice Department. And in foreign affairs, think of what's at stake, Valerie. 194 ambassadors around the world, our relationship with NATO, bilateral agreements, including the Paris Climate Accords and so on, the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, North Korea, Iran, and the continuing challenge of China. Who would want to be the president of the United States? And in a short period, that person has to get ready for all of this, just one more. And we also have a world presence, 750 United States military bases in 80 countries around the world. At the moment, 228,390 U.S. military personnel in foreign countries, some of them not altogether friendly, and 168,571 active duty troops. The stakes are enormously high.
And one norm that our organization has tried to change is that the thing that presidential candidates are thinking about in the election year, they're thinking about winning the campaign. And you even heard through John McCain statements like, to talk about preparing to govern, to talk about preparing to manage this task is measuring the drapes, and it's unseemly. And we've tried to move the needle to say, if you have a credible chance of becoming president, if you're in the spring of the election year, one of the 2 or 5 last people standing, then you should start in the spring of the election year. Start with a small team to start organizing your plan to make 4,000 political appointments, 1,300 of which require Senate confirmation, and choosing the right people to implement your policy priorities. I know we'll talk more about what a really hard task that is.
And so the new president has to move his whole life, unless he's an incumbent, has to write an inaugural address, has to meet with domestic and foreign ambassadors and other people of great stature. There are many things on the president's mind aside from all of this, and your organization exists as a nonpartisan service 501c3 to help the government do this in a smooth and thoughtful and efficient way.
Exactly. We try to support the incumbent administration to do that really hard task of preparing to hand over, which is especially emotional for a candidate in their first term who doesn't really want to hand over yet. To prepare presidential candidates, not to help define policy or make policy plans for them, but to just talk about the structure of building an organization to support you, the candidate, in accomplishing your priorities. And we also work with federal agencies who are the continuity of knowledge across administrations so that they have a community of expertise to manage the processes well.
And you are a nonpartisan director of a nonpartisan agency, very important to state. So you're careful about what you say because you don't want any partisanship to cloud this process.
That's right. I feel uniquely designed in a lab to be supportive of all the players in the process because I've been a career civil servant, I've been a political appointee, I've worked for 3 very different administrations, and so I do feel very supportive of everyone involved. So if I say something critical tonight, it's from a sort of maternal perspective of like...
Or a process perspective.
Yes, but like, this would help you if you did it this way. Yes, so thank you for
I'm sure your children love that speech.
Yeah.
Let's go to 7 for a minute. Just want to emphasize these great caricatures that were done by our friend in Salida, Mr. Nate Calderon. He's a friend of mine. He's done some work for me. We asked him to try to visualize presidential transition. Now, we had to decide whether we wanted to have any of these marked top secret or for the Mar-a-Lago bathroom. We decided not to go that way, but I think that's a lovely icon. Let's go to the next one. And this is a little more, shall we say, violent. Don't let the door hit you as you leave.
That's what people are feeling. That may not be what they do, but that's how they feel.
Exactly. I love Nate's work, and we're going to continue to work with him over time, but I wish he were here. It's so great to see what a true graphic artist could do by embodying these ideas. And now we have a couple of the cartoons I just want to go over before we go on. These are not local. We looked at hundreds of cartoons. We wanted to keep it as nonpartisan as we could. Here's one, the peaceful transfer of power. He's not my president. I think we've all heard that over and over in the last 6 or 7 years. How about this one? The peaceful transfer of what? Going back to the Obama-Trump transition. Great caricature of Obama. And this one. Now this, we got to spend some time on, my friends. This is by a cartoonist named McKay, possibly Mackay. He's Canadian. And this is from a newspaper in Hamilton, Ontario, The Spectator there. And so we need to sort of parse this one because I know you're not as close to the screen as you might wish. So, James, if you'd show the first thing, that would be the United States Constitution burning. And next, that is the throne. You know, Charles II, Richard II, Henry VIII. This is T2. And if you see, Elon Musk has a chair also down in the lower corner. Now, third. This one's a little upsetting, actually. Remember that Joe Biden had a bust of Robert F. Kennedy in the Oval Office. That one is now shattered on the ground to the right, and that's RFK Jr. now on the pedestal. Next, Maybe you have a hard time seeing this. This is Mr. Hegseth, the designee for the Department of Defense. That's his tattoo design box. And next, that's, we were told this is going to be an administration of retribution. There are the stocks. We'll see, Valerie, if you ever wind up in the stocks there. And next, someone in the kind of a high school gimmick has pasted "kick me" on the back of the somewhat limping outgoing president of the United States, and poor George Washington, looking a little nervous about the future of the American Republic. Just a couple of other quick notes about this. The tie, that long red snake-like thing, is one of the celebrated Trump ties, red. And then over on the right, above Elon Musk's throne, I believe it's one of two things. It's hard to decide. That's either a portrait of Matt Gaetz, or it could be Eddie Munster. Hard to know. Those Canadians, they're so hard on us. There's an awful lot in this interesting cartoon. So, and one more. I'm hoping for a peaceful transition of power, but that is up to you. So, with that in mind, I want to go back now to number 15. And so, the book that you can get, the bookworm is here. We so appreciate them, and we appreciate all independent bookstores. So please buy this book if you can. I love this book. This is, when we start these programs, we do a lot of reading and thinking and sort of saying who's doing interesting things in this way. And David, I bought this book and I was just blown away by how interesting it is, because it follows, it's an oral history. It's called The Peaceful Transfer of Power, an Oral History of America's Presidential Transitions. And it follows a whole series of transitions, a couple of which are just really remarkable. For example, when Chris Christie attempted to provide that kind of service for incoming Donald Trump in 2016 and 17, poor Chris Christie. We could talk a little bit about that. Later, also FDR and Hoover. It's a fabulous book. And so in the introduction, he says this, and I just want to go through these, and then I'll go through them all, and then we'll come back. What's the problem?
Apologies. There's a Tesla in the parking lot that is blocking a van. If you drove a Tesla tonight and you think you might be in front of a van, we would very much appreciate your help sliding out so that this young lady can leave the parking lot. And I trust that Joe can cut this out in the post, so you won't see me in the recording.
Elon Musk, there you go. All right. So let's, is it all right to go forward? Apologize for that. We will cut that in the recording, and thanks. We'll make sure that gets taken care of. So David Marchik and his team, he wasn't alone in this, of course, has 5 issues and principles of transition. And I want to ask you, Valerie, particularly, and you too, Doug, but Valerie, you're closer to it. Number 1, transition planning must start early. Candidates and their team should begin the process by spring of the election year, if not earlier. Number 2, transition teams must learn from their predecessors. As we will see, too many have repeated the mistakes of the past. Number 3, a candidate must hire the right team, starting with the transition chair. Number 4, transition teams must prioritize the selection, vetting, and training of political appointees. And this one's a little more complicated, but it involves 2-term presidents, essentially. Incumbent administrations must help their successors as well as engage in planning for a second term. If seeking re-election, the handoff by an outgoing president is frequently choppy, even if there's no change of party, which is a little bit surprising, but we'll come back to it. So let's go back to the first one. So Valerie, you know all these by heart, of course. Give us a little report card of the current transition along these lines.
So you laid the table well for the first one. It is so important. The federal government is so complex. You have to start planning.
We're the most consequential nation in the world.
Exactly, $6 trillion budget. And so what we saw in this cycle was not quite as much as improvement as we had seen in previous ones, where, of course, we had one candidate, Biden, as the incumbent president, focused more on responsibly doing that handoff of power, and also maybe setting a new standard for second term planning. We won't dwell on that tonight, but that's something that you hear from colleagues in the Bush and Obama administrations, that you don't have a lot of time to think much about second term planning. So there was an opportunity
And
there.
Mr. Biden was planning, if he were reelected, to have a smooth and really thoughtful transition, you're saying?
Absolutely, yes. So on both fronts,
He's been around for a long time in Washington.
Yes, so on the handoff perspective, well organized. On the thinking about a second term perspective, well organized. But of course, in July, candidate changed. And so for the Harris team, they announced their transition chair in August, earliest possible opportunity they could do that. And they selected Johannes Abraham, who had run an outstanding transition for the Biden team in 2020 as the number 2 under Senator Kaufman.
So I know you don't want to give a grade, but number 1, the Trump incoming did pretty well, but not as well as they might have done.
Yeah, well, I started with the good news. So Harris team did as well as you could in this regard. The Trump team waited until August to name their transition chair too, compared to 2016 when Trump had Christie in place in the spring and Hillary Clinton did. Modern candidates have had their transition chairs in place in the spring. It appears that the Trump campaign was really relying on some of these outside organizations, and there were many. Heritage was the most well-known one, but America First Policy Institute was very thoughtful, very deliberate on their policy planning, and the Trump campaign knew that these efforts were out there and would be there to support them. And it's a likely reason they didn't prioritize having one chair until August. It does also appear that the need to then reconcile several competing plans and teams from August to November and beyond might have slowed them down.
So transition is not monolithic. There are factions that are trying to get the attention of the candidate and the winner.
Yes, and what you need is one person, and this gets to number 3.
Let's go to 3, to jump to 3.
Yeah, so you need somebody who speaks with the authority of the president, who is close to the president, who is running this effort, and also understands that it is secondary to the campaign, it's behind the scenes, you're not making policy, you're just creating the plans to implement the policy. So somebody sort of low ego who can do this too. So Biden in 2020 appointed his longtime Senate Chief of Staff and the senator who followed him, Ted Kaufman, to lead his campaign, or to his transition. So a tremendous amount of gravitas, close relationship, had the authority to do this, and understood how to defer to the campaign. In 2016, the Chris Christie example, somebody very senior, somebody who managed the process very well from spring to the election. But what you found at that time was that at the election, when the rubber hit the road, the president did not have trust in his plans and literally threw them out and started over.
So is this really true? I've read Chris Christie's book and I've read David Barczyk's book. Is it really true that Chris Christie did actually a splendid job, vetted a wide range of potential appointees, did policy reviews and agency reviews, and put together some 13 or 20 fat 3-ring binders, which is basically a master plan for the transition? And is it true that Jared Kushner literally dumped them all in a dumpster?
I mean, I wasn't physically there next to the dumpster, but yes, that is what you hear from everybody who was involved.
So that gets an F, I think, in your grid here of planning.
Yeah, to have to start over and to do all of that work, it was a chaotic period by the account of everybody involved. Lots of hardworking, serious people, but no clear lines of authority. Just a very difficult scenario to prepare to hit the ground.
The account
running.
of this in this book is just spectacular. It's an oral history, and we hear a great deal about it. And Chris Christie's own memoir, somewhat bitterly, goes over the same ground. So just quickly back now to 4 and 5. Let's go to 4 and 5. Must prioritize vetting. I think you've said before that the vetting process has been not as efficient or as quick as it should have been on this case.
Yes. So some of the things that we've learned and codified over the last 20 years are practices for the candidates to start the background investigation process with the FBI. So the 2004 Intelligence Reform Act encouraged the FBI to process transition team background investigations so that there could be classified briefings between election and inauguration. The Presidential Transition Act also encourages the DOJ to prioritize background investigations for high-level national security nominees so that they're done and ready to take their jobs on January 20th. And the Senate, of course, expects this information. And then the other complicated process that's parallel to this is the Office of Government Ethics review of financial disclosures. And when you are looking at cabinet secretaries, they are traditionally very senior people, and certainly in this cycle, you see people with a large amount of assets. So it is a long process that relies on the nominees themselves to provide that information. And that should typically start and be completed before they are publicly announced, because if they have to make tough decisions about, am I going to divest $1 billion in my personal portfolio, they may want to do that without public attention on
Or is there a
first.
scandal in one's private life or something? This needs to be theoretically processed before the announcement.
Exactly.
Let's go to David Marchik, number 2. So I had the great honor of being able to interview David Marchik for this program. It was an hour-long interview, and he's really extraordinarily fascinating. And this is the second of 2. This is about that very thing, about the delay, especially when you're talking about very wealthy appointees.
And Marco Rubio will do a good job. You know, Marco Rubio is not who a Democratic president would pick, but he's a smart guy. He's been around, and he'll do a good job. It's in the areas which are domestic and which have regulatory authority, he picks true outliers.
This is Mr. Trump.
So the Justice Department, the EPA, and a few other agencies. So, you know, I think this is intentional by design as opposed to haphazard. I mean, I think he wants to have, typically attorney generals are the people's lawyer, and they operate with a great degree of independence. He doesn't want that independence.
So, Doug, I want to bring you in. I'm sorry it's taken so long to get back to you, but this is so fascinating.
Yeah, I'm learning so much myself. Yeah, I'm loving it.
So let me ask you the same question.
I'll take your constitutional law class. I need that.
When in your life did you first sort of begin to think, oh, presidential transitions are a very interesting and vulnerable moment in our life?
The first time I thought about it was the first election I ever voted in, which was 2000. I was 21. And I had not paid too much attention to it, but I was somewhat political, and the election was very contested. I was very interested in what was happening in Florida. I was watching this, and I remember sitting with my entire family and watching the concession speech by Al Gore on TV. I hadn't voted for him in full disclosure, but in that moment, I realized how significant it was what he was doing. And I thought, oh, maybe I could have voted for that guy. He looks pretty remarkable in this moment. And that speech, in my opinion, is one of the most remarkable political speeches maybe in our country's history. Just the stakes, the things that he said, what it led to. And of course, 9 months later, we're dealing with 9/11 and the smooth transition to recognize at that moment, George W. Bush is the President of the United States. There's no question about that by September. It was a coming of age for me in understanding politics, and it was through a transition of power that still resonates with me really deeply.
Yeah, so we'll come back to the AG because I know that's very important to you. But let's look at that very speech you say is one of the great ones in American history. It's short, a couple of minutes here.
I offered to meet with him as soon as possible so that we can start to heal the divisions of the campaign and the contest through which we've just passed. Almost a century and a half ago, Senator Stephen Douglas told Abraham Lincoln, who had just defeated him for the presidency, "Partisan feeling must yield to patriotism." I'm with you, Mr. President, and God bless you. Well, in that same spirit, I say to President-elect Bush that what remains of partisan rancor must now be put aside, and may God bless his stewardship of this country. Neither he nor I anticipated this long and difficult road. Certainly neither of us wanted it to happen. Yet it came, and now it has ended, resolved as it must be resolved through the honored institutions of our democracy. Over the library of one of our great law schools is inscribed the motto, "Not under man, but under God and law." That's the ruling principle of American freedom, the source of our democratic liberties. I've tried to make it my guide throughout this contest, as it has guided America's deliberations of all the complex issues of the past 5 weeks. Now the U.S. Supreme Court has spoken. Let there be no doubt. While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession. I also accept my responsibility, which I will discharge unconditionally, to honor the new president-elect and do everything possible to help him bring Americans together in fulfillment of the great vision that our Declaration of Independence defines and that our Constitution affirms and defends.
Applaud if you think that's the standard.
Yeah.
And what a class act. You know, he was bitter. He was pretty certain that the election had been taken away from him in a partisan Supreme Court. He gives this magnificent speech. You just got to think what an extraordinary act of character and integrity that was.
Well, he says this line, and I'm a lawyer, so I'm a little partial to this one point in the speech, but he says, I disagree with it, but I accept it. And for our country to go forward, our leaders have to recognize that they are a part of a larger institution that is our country that's existed for 250 years, will continue to exist long after any of us are around. And I think that statement by him recognizes that moment. You know, and he has very good reasons to be upset by the Supreme Court. It's not a very well-written decision. It's not a very well-reasoned decision, but it comes from the institution, as he says, that was dictated by our country to resolve these things, and he accepted it. And I think that speech really mattered, much as I think the speech on the ellipse mattered in January 2021. It's not an accident that, you know, the Gore supporters, as upset as they were, they won the popular vote. He's the incumbent vice president. He's got keys to the White House. He's got to certify the election. Has every reason to finagle a way to stay in. Says this, and his supporters stand down. And when you give a speech that says the opposite, it's not an accident that the people follow their leaders, and it's why we got to a different point, which I think is a very low mark in our country in terms of how we think about transitions. So yeah, for me, that really stands out as remarkable. And let me just point this out, because I've shown this to my election law and constitutional law class for the last 10 or 15 years since I've been teaching. 1 year, I actually cried. It was very embarrassing, but I just got caught up in the moment, and I had to gather myself because it was so powerful, just the way that class was running. This year, for the first time, I showed this video in November, the end of my election law class. And I teach at CU Boulder. About 80% of the students are very liberal. The other 20% are very quiet. I don't know what they are.
It's Boulder.
And it's Boulder. They could be quiet liberals. And I was stunned because the class just called me out and said, how can you set this up as a standard? This person's weak. He's not fighting hard enough. We're in a new age. You take what you can get. And they were very explicit about it. And I'm still kind of processing that. I think that what's been happening in recent years is actually changing the views of people who are going to be the leaders of our country down the road. I think there are lingering effects to some of these things.
How fascinating. And he says the motto at one of our great law schools, he doesn't say it's Harvard because he doesn't want to invoke that sort of elitist card. Pretty amazing. So just before we go on, let's look at the opposite. I think we have a little clip from one Carrie Lake of Arizona.
Well, I think Americans are coming around to the fact that it wasn't an insurrection. It was a staged riot. It was a staged riot to cover up the fact that they were going to certify a fraudulent election.
So two things there, fraudulent election and that the January 6th attack on the Capitol was a staged deep state riot to cover up the fact that the Democrats had lost the election and wanted to stage the riot to cover that ground. So that's the opposite end of the spectrum, but be that as it may. So, Doug, I want to go back to the Attorney General. So, ideally, sort of in our in our civics understanding of America, we want the AG to be essentially nonpartisan. That's never really the case. But you want that person to have more independence of the political process than others. Now, we've failed many times. Robert Kennedy was John Kennedy's AG and so on. But we do hope that there's a kind of a structural independence of the judicial department and the AG. And I know that's of great concern to you in this transition.
Absolutely. Now, that has not always been the way that the country has worked, but it's definitely been the case since Watergate. It was one of the big reforms. There's a lot of ethics reforms in the 1970s. One of them is establishing a firewall between the political appointees and the career attorneys at the Department of Justice, and between what the president can and will say and his advisors and what the attorneys at the Department of Justice are doing. And that has been eroded. This was just spoken about. David Marchik pointed this out. You know, Donald Trump views the Attorney General as his personal attorney and his personal attorney to do kind of the dirty work, to go do stuff, to muck up things, to start controversies, to sue people. And the Attorney General is the Attorney General of the United States. I mean, that is the title. It's not the Attorney General of the President. Nonetheless, the President appoints this person. That doesn't happen everywhere. We elect the Attorney General in our state. So it's possible we could change that. We could elect the Attorney General of the United States. That would create independence because they would be beholden to their electorate instead of to the person who appointed them. So we're relying on this historical norm, and the reason the norm has held is because when the president has asked lawyers to do things that violates the law, they've said no. The famous Saturday Night Massacre, during the impeachment of Nixon.
Elliot Richardson refusing to go along with Nixon's desire to fire a number of people, including...
Yes, and a special counsel and an investigator.
Archibald Cox.
There were some people in the Trump administration who were in the Attorney General's office who also said no. If that changes, and that was a part of Pam Bondi's, a lot of the Senate hearing was, are you going to be able to say no to your boss ever? And if she's not, then we've crossed the Rubicon and we're in a different world. And now the law enforcement apparatus that's supposed to protect us from our government is now going to be the arm that is potentially putting us at risk.
I want to say the same thing of you that I said of Valerie, that you say this as a nonpartisan. You're a political centrist, even though you live in Boulder. And if you would say this if this were Bill Clinton wanting to weaponize the Department of Justice to get at his perceived or real enemies. In other words, you're not saying that this is just about Donald Trump. You're saying that this is a standard which you would decry no matter which president is using it to weaponize that department.
Correct. I don't know if you want to call me nonpartisan. I don't like politicians. And so I don't care who wins. You know, I'm not in it to help. I vote, so I have a personal preference. What I really try to study and figure out is what is the law. And maybe it's naive, but this is the place where I'm at. And I teach the students, this is what the law is. And I'm teaching that to you because I want you to respect it. I'm also teaching it to you so when it's violated, you understand why it's a big deal. And it's not just, well, someone else is in power, so you get to do whatever you want. That's not the case. So there are these things that are the rule of law that we must follow. And when we don't, the first step is we have to recognize that they're being broken. These statistics you put up here about what the president does makes one wonder whether we're giving the president the right amount of power. What we're not talking about is the transition of power in the Senate or the House of Representatives. That's also a big branch of government, more powerful than the president in our Constitution. And what's the transition look like for a senator? Well, they're not hiring 4 million people. They're hiring 7 staffers. You know, a couple of legislative analysts to write some memos, some people to write letters, but there's 100 of them. We don't talk about that. We've given an enormous amount of power to our president, and that thus leads to the need to dictate this. But there's another solution to this, and that is to spread power out among the branches of government or more to the states than we have. We've solidified so much in the present, the stakes are high. But that's a choice that we've made as a country. It's also a choice that we could change. We don't just have to say, well, now that the stakes are high, let's cross our fingers you don't lead an insurrection. We can think about the balance of power in our country. I think we should have those conversations.
And so that the rise of a monarchical presidency really dates back to Theodore Roosevelt, and it's gone up and down since, but it mostly just gets more powerful every time. Before we go to the next topic, I just want to ask you one last question. So there are really 3 standards of restriction on power. One is the Constitution itself, and you've already said it's often very silent on such questions. Then there's the law, positive law, beginning in 1963, and with amendments since, this has been part of our legal system. And then there are norms. And would you just explain the difference between law and norms? Because here's a norm, that the person who loses puts in a call to the winner and says, I'm sorry I lost, but I just want to congratulate you. I'll do whatever I can to be cooperative. Here's another norm. The loser comes to the inauguration and so on. John Adams broke that. Others have broken that. But just define for us the difference between law, Constitution, and norms?
Yeah, and I would add a fourth category of tradition. I would say showing up to the inauguration of your victor is a tradition. A norm is something that people talk about and that sometimes they write down even. It's not a law because it's never been voted on by Congress, but it does have documentary proof. These are the things we are going to do, like a mission statement. Some organizations have that. It's not a policy that's formally implemented, but it's something that's written down that they follow. Another example of the norm, we talked about the Presidential Transition Act, 1963. JFK also issues an executive order, 11030, if you care to look it up, which you probably don't. And it says that all future executive orders shall not be issued unless the Attorney General and the Office of Legal Counsel of the Department of Justice vets them so that they're legally sufficient. That's been in place since the 1960s. It's written down. Every president has followed that until very recent times. That's not a law because Congress did not pass it. It's not constitutional because the founders didn't write it. But it's more than a tradition because it's been written down, it's been followed, it's been codified in the Federal Register as a code of federal regulation, 1 CFR 19-2. So it's in a place. That becomes something that when those are violated, you can't say someone's breaking the law, but you can say, that's not the way we do things around here, and that should mean something.
So JFK does an executive order saying, hereafter, executive orders must be vetted to show that they're constitutional and that they pass muster before they are in effect.
Correct.
So on that basis, I don't know how many executive orders Joe Biden did in the first
17
days,
on his first day.
and how many Donald Trump has just done.
We're pushing 100.
All right. And just out of curiosity, how many of those 100 or so have been vetted in that way that JFK intended?
We don't know yet. So the Biden administration, they came to office, day one, we're going to do all these things. It's kind of a new campaign strategy. They did have career officials at the Department of Justice and legal law firms vet them and write reports that what was happening was deemed to be constitutional, including, as I mentioned, people in the Department of Justice, and had the new Attorney General vet them before they were signed. He announced them on day one, but didn't sign them and add them to the Federal Register until later.
And that's the right procedure, you're saying?
Well, that's the norm.
Right.
Right, so that is the procedure that we follow. Sometimes that doesn't work out. So we don't know how much vetting has happened in the last 2 months with the Trump team. They haven't issued any report saying, here are the lawyers that we had vouch for these things. And he has signed them, and they are added to the Code of Federal Register already. It could be that that happened, but they have not been very transparent about it, which I think they would want to be transparent about it, because if you can show a court that a lawyer has said this is okay, then the courts are more likely to uphold it. President Obama on day one said we're shutting down Guantanamo Bay. That was his executive order. Wasn't really vetted. Guess what happened? Didn't work. Right, so if you don't get it vetted, it doesn't contain the same oomph down the road.
So I think you're saying let's show a little caution here because we don't yet know. We'll know later how much vetting has gone on. But just to take an example from Trump term number one, the Muslim ban turned out to be unconstitutional, and it had to be rewritten to be a much different sort of ban, more targeted, more justifications before it passed muster. So,
correct.
And you're saying it would have helped if that mustering and that vetting had occurred before the issuing of that executive order.
Yes, and executive orders have a lot of gray area about what could be constitutional or not because the president is passing them or writing them. Some of them are blatantly unlawful. You cannot target people because of their religion. That's just, it says in the Constitution, you can't do that. It also says if you're born in this country, you're a citizen. It just says that. So there's a new executive order that says that's not the case. If your parents weren't citizens but you were born here, you're not. That's unconstitutional.
It'll be tested in the courts.
Sure, and that one will be easy to get rid of, because there's no gray area.
You think that the courts will strike that down?
100%.
You heard it here.
Yeah.
100%. We'll
Yes.
hold you to this. We're going to run this clip for all of your first-year students at CU.
We're in bigger trouble if we're in that world where we just ignore the literal words that say all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens. And I would venture to say that the people who Trump would like to say aren't citizens, if they've committed a crime, he would want to arrest them. They're subject to our jurisdiction. I mean, just as plain as day. So some of them are unlawful, but some of them are grayer, and it would be nice to have some career officials at the Department of Justice, whose job it is to let the country know that these things are okay. So come out and say so.
Just one last question. Valerie, jump in anytime you want. But surely Barack Obama knew the Kennedy code of vetting, and yet he didn't follow it in that instance that you're talking about, and maybe others. And surely Donald Trump and his people know that tradition
Yes.
of executive orders, and they have just trampled on it in some cases, not necessarily all.
Yeah, I don't like politicians for that reason, because they use the law to do these things. Go ahead and say you want to do that, but don't use the imprimatur of an executive order that looks like it has the force of law, but do it in a way that's unlawful. And it's just as ugly when Barack Obama does it as when Donald J. Trump does it.
And just to be clear, the Constitution makers did not create a power of executive order.
Correct.
The Constitution is silent on that question. Almost all presidents have done it, beginning with George Washington, but the tradition until at least the 20th century was that executive orders were about policy questions and process and relatively minor things. They began to get huge in the 20th century. The most notorious is the internment camps for Japanese American citizens during World War II. So executive orders have become a real problem from the philosophy of what a republic is and checks and balances, but they're all doing it now.
They're all doing it. The Constitution does say that the president is the chief executive officer, basically, of our country.
Right.
So inherent in that power is the power to issue edicts. That's what the courts have recognized. But the courts have also been very clear. One of the other very notorious executive orders, Harry S. Truman, says, we're seizing all the steel mills in our country and forcing them to produce for the war, even though labor is trying to shut them down. And the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. You have no authority from the Constitution related to labor law. You have no authority from Congress, and Congress has passed a law that is in contradiction to your executive order. Therefore, your executive order means nothing. So Congress has the ability, if Trump's passing these executive orders, to pass laws that could frustrate them, and they will win. There's precedents in 1953 from the United States Supreme Court that's been upheld many, many, many times that would strike them down.
So put up the Senate, please. So Valerie, you've been listening to all of this, and it's fascinating. We live in a system that the founders designed for checks and balances, we call them today guardrails, but that no one entity of the three branches of the national government would have dominion, that the president would check the Congress, and the Congress would check the president, and the House might check the Senate, and vice versa, and the court would sit outside the process as wise jurists to make sure everything passed muster in the Constitution. That appears to be an eroded set of checks and balances.
So you set that up so well. I want to take us one step back before we leave executive orders and say, in addition to the question of are they lawful, have they been fully vetted on the legal side, there's the are they operationally implementable question. If you are in the White House and you're the president, you're running typically a several-month interagency process to kind of explore what is possible in this case. And a huge problem for Obama and Guantanamo in closing it down was, what do you do with all the people there?
Right.
So they had to embark on—
I mean, the prisoners there.
The prisoners, right. Yes. So they had to do international negotiations for years to try to find places that would accept people in twos and threes.
Guantanamo is still open, of course.
Yes. So so you have that problem. The Muslim travel ban that you raised was another example where it was, sort of a vision by the campaign or transition team, but had not been vetted with the operational agencies. And so Trump took office, planes were in the air, this order came out, and all of the personnel managing Customs and Border Protection and entry of people into the country had no idea what they were supposed to do upon the arrival of these individuals. And it was weeks of trying to figure that out, Department of State, elsewhere. So this is a process that is also hard to do when you're out of office, you're in a transition team, but you do have resources and relationships to try to work on that question.
So I know that everyone here has questions, and I want to get to those, but I just want to do a little bit more first, and also questions are coming in from our people streaming from elsewhere. So, and I'll get back to separation of powers, but one more thing about executive orders. So is it possible, and this is for either of you, that an incoming president will sign an executive order maybe thinking it's not operational, or maybe thinking it will not pass muster, but doing it to please his partisans? In other words, I tried to ban the Muslim travel, and the deep state prevented me. Is it possible that these are political stunts in a certain way?
There's definitely, Doug's been talking about hating politicians, and there's the
That's
campaign.
the takeaway for Professor Douglas Spencer.
And I think you could, what I do to sleep at night, I guess, is there's the campaign side of things, there's the politics and winning the game, and then there's the policy and implementation and governing side of things. And transitions are important because they're the fulcrum between them. You're trying to take those promises and turn them into something real and actionable. So.
All right, so let's go to the guardrails and the separation of powers and checks and balances. And I remember John Adams in a late letter to Jefferson saying, checks and balances, Mr. Jefferson, checks and balances, and really wanting to make sure that our system never got into a runaway situation. That's what the founders had in mind. Don't let any entity have too much power, and make sure there's always something that can check any excess, any extra constitutional act, or even an act that's not good policy. So with respect to the 1,300 people that will be confirmed or not by the United States Senate, we count on the Senate to be a guardrail, to say that candidate is not really up to muster. And typically, the challenges have been two. One is this person fit for this office? And the second one is, does this person have scandals or other issues that make it impossible for us to want to confirm that? We count on that. From what I can see, and I'm just looking from the outside, it doesn't look like the Senate is likely to play a very significant role in that check.
So if you look at the last 20 years of our history, it's an incredibly important process. Throughout our history, it's an incredibly important process. It is not working for anyone involved. Where first you just look at the massive number, 1,300 people. The Senate is arguably the most important deliberative body in the world. They have other business to do than to vote on 1,300 personnel. So it's almost impossible to get through that number in a president's first year or two. And so the average time to confirmation has gone from 43 days in the Reagan administration to 191 days in Biden's term. And that's the average. So you think cabinet secretaries get confirmed in around 10 days, deputy secretaries in around 60. They're the chief operating officers of these massive departments of 200,000 people. They don't have a chief operating officer for 2 months. And then assistant secretaries who are often managing $3 billion grant programs, they're not confirmed for 300-400 days. And so you have vacancies in agency leadership. So you have very qualified, thoughtful career officials filling those gaps, or maybe more junior political appointees stepping up, but they're often dual-hatted and may feel like they can't make long-term decisions. You have presidents who don't have their desired people in place. The Senate is spending 59% of its votes in the Biden administration were on cloture and personnel-related matters. 59% of its votes. That's not why anybody becomes a senator. And then it's not a way to attract talented people into government either, where they're waiting in this personal and professional limbo for months with no idea of when it will end, not sure where they can send their kids to school, or can I take this contract in my consulting business? So that side of the process is not working at all. And you're asking the question of, is the Senate going to fully review President Trump's nominees? And at the moment, And I think this is changing day by day, but you see Republican senators delaying hearings, rescheduling them, asking for background investigations and a financial disclosure paperwork that wasn't complete. That's very important because if you confirm someone without that financial disclosure paperwork being complete, there really is no incentive at that point for that to ever be completed. So you really want to see that norm be held. There are big questions about how much pressure they can withstand. So I think we're taking this day by day.
Now, when you say that the Senate is the most august debating society in the world, I think Doug threw up a little in his throat, so be careful on that kind of talk.
So they gave themselves that title, it should be pointed out.
So, but also, and not to beat up on Mr. Trump, but we're talking about process here. He also has a penchant for acting secretaries that don't require Senate confirmation, and that works around the traditional process.
Yes, and the Federal Vacancies Reform Act has some things that are very clear about it in terms of who can act in certain positions, and some things that have been sort of as a norm. We lost me.
There we go.
That have been more creatively interpreted over time. So we put out a guide this year. Couldn't do a one-page summary. We did a 12-page summary of how this has been interpreted and what recent GAO and OLC rulings have found about when somebody can act out of the order of succession. But there's sort of a risk-averse and risk-tolerant legal posture that you see different administrations taking. And I think this, as you're suggesting, it was sort of a risk-tolerant legal posture.
Doug, just as long as we're on this, you're the constitutional expert. What is a recess appointment? What does the Constitution say about recess appointments?
Well, our Constitution's very vague. We are in a world now where we think maybe we need to have a bunch of rules in place to protect us against the bad actor, as opposed to giving inspiration and space and direction for the good actors. And so one of the things you want to have is a continuity of government. And you know you're not going to have somebody sitting in these seats for a long time. Maybe they die, maybe they resign, maybe the Senate's taking some time. And there is a possibility if the Senate is in recess, which used to happen quite frequently,
And
but doesn't happen
for
long periods of time, the president could then appoint somebody to lead an agency during that period of time so that we don't have a government that's empty. Also to prevent the Senate from gaming the system and saying, well, we're going on strike and now you'll never get your people put in place. But while they're out, the president can put somebody in, and the Senate comes back, then they advise and consent, and they have to go through the process again. It's different than some of the appointments that Trump was putting in, which are these acting people. He
That's
found
not
this.
recess, that's just
it's not.
acting.
It's just an acting role. There are rules around that. People have to have been in a position that's within a level and in government for a year or two or something. The different places have different rules.
That's law, not Constitution.
Correct, but that was passed by the Congress. The Constitution allows the president to put someone in if the Senate's on recess.
And the first case of recess appointment was in Jefferson's administration, and he had a foreshortened transition time too, because there was a constitutional crisis and the House of Representatives took 36 ballots. He wasn't made president until February 17th, and his installation was on the 4th of March. But he wanted Albert Gallatin to be a Secretary of the Treasury and knew that the Senate would not confirm Gallatin because Gallatin was a partisan, small r Republican. So he made a recess appointment. Gallatin turned out to be one of the greatest Secretaries of the Treasury in American history. So it's a tool, and it can be used in all sorts of directions.
Correct.
Okay, Valerie, before we go on, one more little thing I want to do before we go to the audience. I'm so eager to hear what they have to say. They've been patiently listening to all of this, and frankly, some of it gets a little bit into the weeds, but that's why we're here. The transitions are very complex issues. How often, if you're allowed to say, did the Biden administration call your office to say, transition, we know you exist to help?
So this is a very sort of personal matter for these teams, especially if they have a small, trusted team that's helping to run their transition in the months before the election. They want to keep this discreet. So we really try not to talk about our conversations with each team. We have worked with candidates on both sides of the aisle in the last several election cycles. Some relationships have been a little stronger than others, and there's areas where I wish we could have provided more support, but we have a good track record, and we want that to continue.
And on both sides of the political spectrum.
Yes.
So, in other words, you know how often the calls come, you just can't tell us because you're protecting the privacy of everybody.
Exactly.
Okay, well, you'll never be back. But of course, you have to protect your agent, your nonprofit. So let's get to this one last thing, and that's of the federal employees. So President-elect Trump has made a pretty big deal out of this, that he believes, and I'm going to try to say this as fairly as possible, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that in his first term, the deep state, as he calls it, by which he means, permanent employees or semi-permanent employees, the thousands and thousands in the bureaucracies, the agencies, prevented him from achieving what he promised that he would do for the American people, because they stalled, they resisted, they were in a kind of a passive-aggressive slowdown, and he didn't like that. So now he wants to go in, and this is Project 2025 and others saying, we need to clear out some of those people, because he has a right, having been duly elected by the people of the United States, to fulfill his vision. So explain this to us. How does it work? I know there's a lot of law around this, but try to give us some context so we understand, because this is going to be a huge debate over the next months.
He issued an executive order at the end of his first term designating this new category of federal civil servants, Schedule F. And it essentially said, if you're a civil servant, which means you're not appointed by the president, you're not confirmed by the Senate, absolutely not, but you hire a job, you apply to a job ad on usajobs.gov because we need to implement some of the government's work. And there's protections for civil servants for good reasons, to let them do the work and focus on getting the work done without blowing in the political winds that shift, in part to keep a continuity in the transition. And he says there are certain individuals that if they are engaged in deciding policy as opposed to doing a ministerial task, then they become at-will employees. The idea, I think, is that he wants to be able to fire people if they're not loyal to him. And he said as much. What's confusing is that he's also run a campaign to shed the government and make it smaller. Kind of the old school conservative view, the government's too big, let's get rid of, the apparatus is too big. FDR created this big, massive administrative state. Steve Bannon says we've got to cut the administrative state down and demolish it. And the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, it's not a department, but it's two guys running around trying to fix the government, Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk. And Vivek Ramaswamy said, if your social security number ends in an odd number, you're going to be fired next week. That's different than you're not loyal to me. And so part of, I think, what the debate's going to be about this is, I think, about 50, 60,000 civil servants that are potentially at risk. It's a lot. They have rights as employees, not just labor rights, but they have rights for due process. If they're fired, they have to know why. And it can't be because Vivek Ramaswamy doesn't like me, or it can't be maybe because I'm not loyal. There's going to have to be a process put in place that's transparent. And Trump does have a mandate to do this, and he does have the right to think about the civil service in this way. I do think this executive order for Schedule F would survive a legal challenge. Its implementation, which was Trump's downfall in the first term, he had big grand ideas and then he just tried to ram them through. He's a CEO, he's like, just do what I said. It didn't work like that. If he's learned his lesson and he's able to execute this in a transparent and thoughtful way, it will withstand legal muster.
So Valerie, I can hear you saying, but is it operational?
Well, it completely prevents a president from accomplishing their agenda if they were to do something like this, because the career civil servants who've been in federal agencies, who are at those senior policy making positions that would be affected by Schedule F, they've been through many administration changes by now, and they've stood up priorities, they've taken them down, they know, okay, is this going to be a business-friendly plan? Is this going to be another element of the plan? They know what's been tried before and what hasn't worked. And sometimes when they talk about that to a new leader, it sounds like they're saying, no, you can't do this. And really what they're saying is, let's try not to do it this way. And it's kind of incumbent on the career civil servant to say, maybe you should try it this way. That hasn't been tried. But I was back in government at DHS in the first Trump term, and the only way we accomplished his biggest priorities there were by working with the career team, where if you want to ask asylum seekers to remain in Mexico during their hearing period, that might not be the way that you, as the employee, would build the program, but what legal and operational questions do we have to answer? Do they have to claim fear of being in Mexico? What would that process look like? How do you schedule their court hearings? How do you get them to their court hearings? And if you can work through that series of questions, as we did at the time with the people who know what questions to ask and how to make it possible, then you can create a program that withstands Supreme Court challenges. And this is something that could be happening across government if you are creating a team environment with the individuals and talking to them in the right way.
Okay, but I just want to play devil's advocate for a moment. Elections matter. The idea of shrinking the size of government and the number of government employees is not necessarily a bad idea. We have a gazillion-dollar national debt and rising. There's nothing essentially wrong-headed about saying we need to shrink the size of government. The question is, how do you do it, and can it be done in a legal process? It's also the case, Jefferson said that the president has a right to surround himself with people of his own stamp. And if a president comes into power and the deep state or the bureaucracy stymies that in one way or another, stalls or whatever, that can be deeply frustrating. And so then you look around, is there a way I can clear out those who are going to get in my way? You're saying it's way more complex than that, and that's kind of a simplistic response. But you do take my point that elections matter and presidents get very frustrated when the giant bureaucracy of Washington will not cooperate.
Well, you could fly me to a country to make a deal with another country, but if nobody around knows how to put it in the Federal Register, then it's like a tree fell in the forest. Like you need people who actually know how to do things. And if we're talking about cost cutting, and Doug is right to say, what is the real motivation here? We were talking before this about the pay to federal employees is really a minuscule part if you're trying to create efficiencies in federal spending, where 25% of the whole federal budget goes to Social Security, and 25% goes to Medicare, and 15% goes to defense spending, and 10% goes to interest on the national debt, and 10% goes to SNAP and other benefits programs. So you start doing that math and you realize there's so little that's left to work with, and you need people to run those programs, the people who actually get the Social Security checks out on time. You don't want to risk that not going well, one would hope.
Can I add one thought that's slightly different, but I'm confused by this.
Okay.
I think it's legal. I don't know about the policy, and certainly it's confusing to me for this reason. Passed by Republicans, or a Republican president, kind of in the theory of the old conservative smaller government. The Republican Party has waged a campaign for since 1984. The Supreme Court passed a decision, Chevron versus National Defense Resources Council. It was the boogeyman for conservatives because it essentially said that if there's a debate when an agency issues a rule, we will defer to the agency. We want the agencies to have that expertise. And there's an interesting backstory that involves a Colorado native, Neil Gorsuch, and his mom. But ultimately, last year, the Supreme Court struck that down, the behest of Republicans and the conservatives. Let's not let the agencies have all the power. We want judges to second guess the agencies. And here we are saying, but we want more power to be in control of the agencies and to tell them what to do. Why? You just neutered the power of the agencies to have any say. So I don't even quite understand what the end goal is for this movement, because there's a goal to make the executive, the administrative state weaker. And I see this as Trump's attempt, even if it's ill-fated, to try to make the administrative state stronger in his mold, do what I say. And those cannot coexist. And so it just leaves me scratching my head on what ultimately is this about?
Yeah, the positive and negative interpretation there. So if the idea is the administrative state should not be making policy through regulations, it should be Congress, there's a fair argument there that Congress should have the responsibility to legislate and give us more guidance on ever-changing issues. That's hard. You know, my social media algorithms feed me senators asking dumb questions about technology issues. Like, it's a really hard thing to legislate on, and that's why we have people who are managing these issues closely, building regulations. So, there is that question of are all the roles in the right place? But to your point, the result is of removing the nonpartisan experts who have pledged to work for whoever the American people elect, and then replace them with loyalists, that is actually creating a deep state.
All right, so Valerie, just want to say, and you know what I'm about to say, that someone like Steve Bannon, were here, would say, you're the problem. You're too close. You're a Washington insider. You give these plausible reasons to leave it alone. And he would say, that's why we have to revolutionize this system.
I think all I'm saying is that our country, our world is facing major challenges and problems, and you need continuity of knowledge and cooperation across administrations so that we're not reversing course, setting up a program for 4 years, taking it down for 4 years, but that we are working together to try to address these problems. One other book recommendation, George W. Bush's National Security Advisor, Stephen Hadley, declassified the memos that the NSC produced for the Obama team to do an assessment of, did we do our job adequately enough to prepare the next team for the challenges facing them? And it's this really honest examination of all of the challenges in the world. And that's the attitude that you want the incumbent administration to be taking in this process.
All right, so last question, we're going to go to questions. So James, let's start. But just last question for you, Valerie, because you're close to all of this. I won't call you an insider, but how anxious is the federal bureaucracy about what's about to happen here?
So we've been working closely with federal agencies over the last 6 months and have seen such integrity in them preparing for whoever the American people elect, to serve 2 teams if necessary for 3 months, and to be good partners in this process. And the campaign rhetoric, the proposals, DOJ, these are truly existential questions. These are people with jobs, supporting their families, and as we're seeing play out over the last 2 days, being told to leave their office by 5 p.m. the next day. And there's a real human impact that is, the president has a right to make changes and surround himself with people he trusts. But there's something that's really uncomfortably ugly about the way people are being treated in the process.
Let's go to questions. Raise your hand. We'll get to as many as possible. And Megan, if you have questions that have come in, let's go with that.
Okay, I have a few quick things. First, please join me in thanking for that discussion Valerie Boyd, Doug Spencer, Clay Jenkinson. Please help us maintain our vision of a community that is well-informed, thinks deeply and critically, and importantly, that engages in exemplary civil discourse.
Wow.
Okay, who's going to start us in the room?
Megan, go ahead.
My question is FBI background investigations. It's been reported that the Bureau will only examine those areas that the incoming administration has highlighted. Is that true?
So one thing that is surprising to learn is a lot of the background investigation process and the way it's structured rests on executive order. So it is something that's very possible for the incoming president to change. And we've already seen some of that in the last 2 days. But typically, the FBI is the standard bearer in this process. And right after the nominating conventions is typically when DOJ enters into agreements with both candidates' teams to start a full investigation of, as you probably know, everywhere they lived, every job they've had, people who are close to them, foreign travel, foreign contacts, financial questions that may lead to potential influence attempts. And so the FBI looks at all of these things. I think the conversation over the last couple of months has been, will the president not use the FBI and use a different type of process? And we did see the executive order on giving more authority to the White House counsel's office to make determinations. It is, as I understand, within the president's right to do so. And the question is that advisable?
Megan?
All right, from our online audience, if Congress can frustrate a president's executive order, can they equally enable an executive order, i.e. approve it once it's been issued? Are there examples of this?
Yes, I can give one. The JFK issued an executive order creating the Peace Corps, and Congress then soon affirmed it with positive congressional legislation. So it happens quite frequently.
That's right. There's a famous framework in a Supreme Court case, the steel seizure case from the 1950s, where the Supreme Court said, if Congress has issued any ruling that's congruent with the executive order, it has the force of law, and the court will always defer to it. If Congress has passed a law that frustrates it in some way, then Congress wins every time. Then there's this zone where the president issues an executive order, and it's not clear whether Congress has spoken on the issue directly. Maybe the president says something about labor law, and there's a law about labor, but it's not about the same thing. That's a gray area where the court said, in those moments, we'll step in and play referee. And so all three branches basically have a role to play in that structure, whether there's congruence or not, based on this framework that's become the constitutional way that these things are evaluated.
Hi, thank you. Boy, trying to wrap my mind around this has been a challenge for sure. But one thing on the other end of the spectrum is pardons. And both parties or both administrations have abused this or taken advantage of it. And then also lawsuits against news organizations. But what does this do to the balance of power or the transition of power? And should there be some controls on pardons?
My personal opinion is yes. I wish that the pardon power were far more constrained. It's not as broad as some people may think. We've learned about this as a people over the last little bit. The constitutional lawyers knew this, but the president's power to pardon is only for criminal action in a federal court. So they can't pardon themselves for a civil action, a fine, and they can't pardon themselves for state crimes, which is why there was all this effort to go to state court to try President Trump instead of to federal court, because he's not able to pardon himself. So there are some limits. They're very small. But it's an unreviewable decision. Courts cannot review it to see whether they're sufficient. There are norms. So typically the Attorney General, and there's an office in the Department of Justice that will review pardon requests, in part because the Department of Justice is often the institution that put these people away. And so they would like to have some kind of say before there's a pardon, like the January 6th insurrectionists who have all been pardoned. They were brought to trial by the Department of Justice, so it's a slap in their face, and so they would usually have a say in that. But I think there should be some.
Did DOJ have a say in
No.
the J6 pardon?
No, and I think they're upset, and I think a lot of judges are upset by it. And I think a lot of Republicans are upset by it too, because it's everybody. People who beat up cops, people who were there on accident, or whatever the story is, everybody. And so, yeah, there's a lot of people who are very frustrated by it. My concern is the January 6th, I think the Biden pardoning his family is really unbecoming, let's say. That's the word I'll choose. The January 6th pardons really stand out to me for this exact reason about the transition of power. Because now we say, go ahead and fight for your country, interrupt Congress, kill a few people, do whatever you need to do, and as long as I get in power, you're free. That sets a new standard for what the transition looks like. Now the next president who wants to be president, they have an extra incentive to get in office. And they have an army of people who are willing to go to bat for them, because if they can do anything to get in, it sets a little bit of a standard. So I do think it implicates the transition, that particular set of pardons. But all the pardons that have happened in the last couple of weeks are disappointing. It's not the way that the pardon structure was set up. It's set up to find instances where somebody served time or the criminal justice system got it wrong. And it's just been wielded in a very cynical way.
We have a related follow-up.
So thank you very much. This is cool. So Andrew Jackson pardoned a lot of the Confederates after.
Johnson, yeah.
I'm sorry, Johnson. Sorry. So and there are some who think, I'm not a big historian, but that had a real impact on the way our country behaved for many decades, and probably still does. And so, do you see any historical references to this pardoning and how this can have a many-decade impact for how we're going to work as a republic?
There's two thoughts come to mind. One is, there's a way in which the same spirit that I think Andrew Johnson was going into that can be exercised, where you may think it's better for the health of our nation if we can end the division and stop, and I think we saw this when Obama came to office. There was pressure from Democrats to go after people in the George W. Bush administration because of the torture memo and things that had happened in Guantanamo Bay and in dark sites around the world. And Obama said, that's not healthy for our country. We're going to move forward. Upset a lot of Democrats by doing that. Didn't pardon anybody, but made some choice about healing. I think the pardons that are going on now aren't issued in the spirit of, well, there's still this division. I also think that there was a very explicit thing happening at the time of Johnson, which was in trying to resurrect and reconstruct our country, we were asking people to ratify amendments to the Constitution so that we could outlaw slavery, we could provide equal protection of the laws, and we could stop discrimination in voting, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. And there was concerns that, the Confederates and that balance was going to tilt how the states ratified those amendments. We don't have those on the table now or anything like that, and I think that shields us somewhat from having that same lingering effect that happened back then. But I don't think it's wrong to think about these parallels.
There are legitimate and good uses of the pardon power.
I think so.
And so you're not suggesting we abolish it. You're suggesting that we clarify it with some law preventing its abuse.
As of January 22nd, 2025, I would agree with you. Let's add some fixes. If we continue to see this happening, the kinds of things, the Biden pardons of his son, his sister-in-law, and the J6, then I would say maybe we get rid of the pardon power altogether, and the sad thing that comes with that at least is offset by what it has become. We're not there yet, but we're getting close.
But the Vietnam draft dodgers and resistors were pardoned as an act of healing the country.
Correct.
This often is used to heal the country after a very divisive period. You're saying it's a little too soon on this one.
Correct. Ford pardoned Nixon for the same reason. It's a little messy, but you have to make a political decision. This will heal our country. I don't see these pardons from Biden or Trump having any healing ability for our country. They're very divisive on both sides. And Biden has given air to say, well, of course Trump can do it. It's whataboutism now. Well, they did it. I'll do it. So he's given air to that. He's also said, I'm just going to pardon my family. And then the pardons from Trump are so broad, no sense about whether somebody actually engaged in violence or not. It's not about healing. It's just about getting even.
And Gerald Ford paid a huge price for his pardon of Richard Nixon. Go ahead.
From our online audience, could you discuss a little bit more the implications of your students' reactions to the Al Gore speech?
So we're a little surprised that your students said,
I'm
go
surprised too. I'm surprised
I thought
too.
you'd cry at that.
Yeah, in my bedroom later. I think that, I showed it the day that Kamala Harris gave her speech. So I showed both speeches, kind of graded them. Did she live up to the standard? Because I consider Al Gore kind of a standard of that. And I think that it could have just come from a moment of, we're upset that the candidate that we wanted to win didn't win, but I think that the students are picking up on something, and that is the way that politics happens in our age is a little dirtier, a little nastier, and a little bit more transactional. And some people will say, it's always been like that, why are you so late to the game? But for people like me, if it was happening behind closed doors because it's kind of gross, and at least you said the right things. Al Gore was probably upset and said terrible things about the Supreme Court. But in front of the American people, he said, this is an institution that I will follow. And I just think that that's not what's happening. I think Donald Trump has changed that. It's his appeal to many people to talk in a little bit more derogatory terms, to use a little, swear a little bit more often than other politicians swore, to say, let's rough people up. And I think that the students who don't support Donald Trump see that as the way for us to win is to not stand there in a red tie and to be the nice guy. The way to win is for us to get our hands dirty. And so I think that may be where they're coming from.
Well, they're saying when they go low, we go low too.
When they go low, we'll go low.
That's where we are now.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, look, a young person. Thank you.
If you could add or change anything about the Constitution, what would it be?
Oh, good. Oh, good. Here we go.
Do you have any thoughts?
No, I'm going to go to the constitutional law professor, sorry.
Yeah.
For me, this is very easy. I would change the makeup of the United States Senate. I think that it makes it impossible for our country to have debates about hard questions and to pass any kind of law because it's not closely representative of anything that is happening in our country, and it's thwarting or stopping a lot of things from taking place. I think that one change could have a bigger impact on the way our government works, the way we talk to each other, than any other changes. And there could be a lot changed, but I think that is the one thing structurally that's making our government not function as good as it could. And we are a great country, and our government should function well. And I think that's stopping us. That's my personal opinion, is that's stopping us from being as great as we could be.
So Wyoming with 500,000 citizens has 2 United States senators. California with 45 million people has 2 United States senators. I take it you think that might have made sense in 1787. It doesn't make much sense now.
It made more sense then. It still didn't make sense then. It just was a compromise, just a transactional. We're not going to get this deal done unless you give us that. Fine. But we didn't recognize what it meant after we expanded west and then gamed the system. Why do we have a North Dakota and a South Dakota?
Hey, wait. There's an answer to that.
I know, but you're picking on Wyoming, and the Dakotas are bringing 4. Anyway, there's ways in which it's really become bad.
Now look at the time.
Look at the time.
I never thought you'd turn on me this way. So just to make sure you understand the history of this, my friend, Jefferson wanted identically sized square states in the West. And so he wanted 2 degrees of latitude, which is North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and then it goes crazy at Texas. So there's a reason to split those 2, geographically speaking, for the same reason we have 4 corners in Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and so on. So this is part of the Jeffersonian grid system.
Yeah.
It doesn't make a lot of sense. If North Dakota and South Dakota combined their populations, it would be about 1.7 million. So it'd still be lower than most other states. We use our power so well. I mean, we're just, we have extra authority. Come on, the South Dakota governor is going to be a cabinet official.
Correct.
And the North Dakota governor is going to be a cabinet official. That's never happened before, so shut up.
Doug, we're both disinvited.
No, I'm never coming back.
That's it, you've had 2.
On that note, Valerie, how much overlap is there normally between the administrations? Do they normally stay on to assist with the transition? How much and how long does the outgoing administration normally stay on?
So we haven't talked about how holdovers sometimes happen, where you'll have Senate-confirmed officials for one administration that the next administration may ask to stay. And this was, again, in the 2008 transition, you saw during the economic crisis that the Obama team kept individuals who were managing small business administration and housing and economic issues, and that this was a really important element of continuity in managing that economic crisis. So there are good examples of this. It is a tool that many new administrations think about using thoughtfully. But the big picture is that we have 4,000 senior people across every federal department and agency that are turning over between 11:59 and 12 p.m. on the same day. And you talk to business leaders who say, you would never run a business that way. It's so it is the career civil service that provides that continuity and helps onboard people when they're coming in with lots of subject matter expertise, but maybe no knowledge about the federal government and how it works.
So another question, but before we get to that, I want to ask just one little follow-up question to that. So something that's interesting in this book and interesting from what I've heard you say is that when an administration is generous to its successor, that administration tends to be generous to its successor. In other words, you pass on good policy, generosity of spirit, thoughtfulness, and it does tend to accumulate. And so President Obama worked very closely with G.W. Bush at a time of great national economic crisis. The next administration, then Obama, wanted to pass on some of that. That's an important norm or tradition that this book really talks about, and I think you do too.
Exactly. When you hear Dennis McDonough, who is Obama's chief of staff, helped manage his incoming and his outgoing, he talks about how grateful they were for that spirit of generosity, and that their goal in 2016 was to have at least an equally cooperative process, and it was a little bit more complicated than that. It requires both parties to be invested.
And W, having learned how difficult it is to suddenly have to accept the presidency, wanted to make sure that President Obama was well prepared when he came in.
Exactly. And he had the benefit of being a second-term president, not running for re-election, knowing what the country was facing, and having that spirit of the country deserves for this next person to be as prepared as possible.
Let's go here.
Professor Spencer, I thought I heard you say that the cabinet position levels had to have a certain amount of expertise in their field. Rachel Maddow has done a series called Public Servant Announcements. You might have seen those. They include Kristi Noem, the governor from South Dakota,
Yes.
Pam Bondi, several others who have little or no qualification for those positions. Could you address that?
Might be a misunderstanding of
Well,
what you said
so
earlier.
I think what I said is in the Vacancy Reform Act, if you're making somebody an acting director of something, there are some rules about terms of service. You can't ever be an acting more than a few levels above where you are in a certain position. There's some rules about that. For cabinet level positions, there are no qualifications whatsoever at all. You don't have to be qualified. You don't have to be fit for office. I think you have to breathe and be alive, but we've never tested that. You could appoint somebody who's dead and see. There are literally no requirements. So the requirements are, does the United States Senate in their August seats, do they deem this person worthy? And that can also have some pretty gross ramifications, because they can take people who are really qualified and say, they're not my person. So striking that balance, we delegate that authority to the United States Senate and hope that they get it right. And that means sometimes we're getting people in office who shouldn't be there because they're unqualified. And sometimes we miss out on people who would be great, who get caught up in political wins and never make the cut. But there are no rules.
Just this about Kristi Noem, she's going to be the border czar, and I'm told that no dogs are now approaching the border.
Quite a legacy.
So, finally a victory.
Given the laws, precedents, norms, what do you believe will actually be mandated and implemented in Trump's first 100 days?
Oh my. What will he accomplish? What will be implemented in the first 100 days?
So there are, it's hard to take the list of, 50 executive actions on the White House website and the 50 more orders that are coming out from OPM and DOJ and different agency leaders. But you see things panning out in just the last 24 hours that the OPM director puts out a memo saying DEI officials need to leave their jobs by 5 p.m. today. I don't think I've seen an assessment precisely of what's happened yet, but it appears likely that a lot of people left their jobs today. And there may be other challenges where agencies are reassigning them or taking legal action, unions taking action to protect them. So that's a great question. You could look at border implementation, at other workforce issues. Where do you begin? That's another 2-hour conversation.
Well, I've got another 100% guarantee. Since you came and stayed till 8, 100%, but 100 days from now, Trump will claim he did more than he did. All right? So it will be hard to tell. He'll say he's fixed everything. I do think we'll see a lot on the border. I think we'll see raids. I think we'll see public deportations. I think we'll see things for him to say, I'm really doing my best to solve this immigration problem in the way that I told you I would, which is finding people and removing them. I don't think it will be widespread, but I think it'll be highly politicized, that people will get the sense that a lot of it's going on, and he's very braggadocious, so he'll let us know about it.
There will be innumerable court cases that emerge from all of this now, of course, as there always are.
Doug, you made kind of an offhand comment that if we didn't like the idea that the president appoints the attorney general, we could change that. And what's the mechanism for that? And is that really realistic with today's very closely and highly partisan both houses?
Yeah, the Attorney General is not an office that's identified in our Constitution as something that has to exist. In the state constitutions of all 50 states, it does list offices, and the Attorney General is listed there. Governor, Attorney General, Secretary of State, and states vary. Some governors appoint attorneys general, and some attorney generals are elected. We would have to change our Constitution. The Department of Justice was created and has changed over time, and the person leading that is the Attorney General. And when the office was created, it was created as an agency, which means the president gets to appoint the leader. In order to have a national election for an office, that office would have to be identified in our national document, which would be the Constitution. So unlikely that we could actually change it, but it is within our power.
So let me forward promote Lindsay Chervinsky is going to be here in March. She's a good friend of mine. She's a frequent guest on my podcast. We've become very good friends. She's coming here. We're going to share this stage together in March. She has a book on the cabinet, and one of the first things she says is the cabinet was kind of invented by George Washington. The Constitution does say there will be executive departments, and so it implies something like a cabinet. But Washington created this. John Adams continued it. Jefferson thought there was no reason to discontinue it, and now it's deeply embedded American tradition, and some of it's protected by law. But you could abolish the Attorney General position or greatly curtail it by positive law. Right. You don't need a constitutional amendment for that if we chose to do that.
Correct. We could eliminate the Department of Justice. We could put limits on what the Attorney General has jurisdiction over. We could put term limits on an Attorney General in ways, and all of that Congress has the authority to do. They could also expand the power. They've tried that. They've said, you know, if someone in the executive agency is engaged in malfeasance, what do you do? Well, the Attorney General can't do it because they have a conflict. You appoint an independent prosecutor. They go after the president. We saw this with Ken Starr and Clinton. We've seen this with Trump and Mueller. And so Congress has the ability to change all of that. The election of an Attorney General would take an amendment.
From the Founding Fathers' point of view, the passivity of the United States Congress is one of the most startling events of the second half of the 20th century. But that's another question. Let's take one more.
We have a follow-up there from here.
Thanks so much for this. A follow-up to the DEI statement from earlier, just the little news piece today that there would be adverse consequences for people in the who are federal employees who do not report that DEI programs have shifted. And I'm just wondering if there's any kind of context, historical context for that. Just a little.
Yeah, it could be a very deliberate reaction to something I've heard former agency officials talk about. When you talk to career officials who were in acting positions in the first Trump term, and they talk about how they navigated building trust with the new leadership team and also supporting a workforce that felt really concerned about the changes. I heard one agency leader say he felt like it was his responsibility to sort of create a Schindler's List every day. These were individuals who were at risk of losing their jobs, and he found places for them to, continue to make a living and stay there till eligible for their pension. And so I think that provision in that memo could be a reaction to knowing that this kind of action is thwarting the desired effect of that order.
Just a couple of quick statements as we wrap up. And James, I know you'll be coming up. You want to do one more question? Oh, okay. Yes. Another young person. Wonderful.
What is the most important part of the transition?
What is the most important part of the transition?
Cooperation across administrations. We have such big issues facing the country and the world. You need the outgoing team to invest in the success of the incoming team. You need the incoming team to plan early, to be receptive to that input, and you need to have political leaders come in who work well with the career team, the people who've been there managing issues across different administrations, because the magic recipe for government effectiveness is taking the urgency and the optimism of political leaders and combining it with the wisdom and experience of career civil servants.
So talk about timely topics. We're just 2 days from the inauguration of the 47th President of the United States. The second president to be reelected after an interim, after Grover Cleveland was the first. I think one takeaway of this is stay tuned, because we don't know, the transition's not over yet. But we won't know how this transition went for a long time, maybe years. We have some concerns and some deep concerns about how this one's being handled, but that's not the first time that's happened either. It'd be nice if we could codify this process more fully. So last thing I want to ask you, Valerie, is if you were in charge of the universe, we hope you will be soon, but...
You'll be invited back if you are, by the way.
Well,
thank goodness! That's all I have to do.
We'll see. But what's the next amendments to the Transition Act?
I think there's at least 6 or 7 of them that might make sense now, but they're all categorized under the fact that right now the Presidential Transition Act assumes that presidential candidates, anyone who wants to run the government, wants to accept the services of government agencies to get ready for that task. So they'll accept a secure IT network from GSA, they'll accept background investigations from DOJ, that they'll want to get briefings from federal agencies on everything they're managing as quickly as possible. And that is not what we saw in this cycle. And there are teeth in the Presidential Transition Act. It asks for, ethics pledges for the transition team members to handle information appropriately. It requires limits on private donations to a transition team effort, and public disclosures to ensure that there's transparency and who has influence over those decisions. But those teeth are tied to accepting government services. So if you want transparency in the donations, if you want ethics pledges, you need to change the recipe in the act.
So we've all thought until recently that these things were locked in, that they always would work, that these transitions are smooth, that incoming presidents take advantage of all the help they can get. President Trump is a self-styled disruptor, so you're saying we're probably going to need to add some more enforcement teeth to some of those things we thought would simply always be accepted by whoever's coming in.
Exactly.
I want to thank you both. I think this has been the most substantive of all of our talks. Valerie Smith Boyd of the Center for Presidential Transition, Doug Spencer of CU Boulder.